Okay, this is about engine temperature issues and whatnot. I'm going to start out talking about my 95 Taurus that I had backed out of the driveway one Saturday morning several years ago, and I heard this loud thump come from under the hood. And there was a gaggle of illuminated warning indicators that came on and a loss of power steering, and so I opened the hood and peeked under there to reveal a broken belt tensioner. And sometimes those things just pop, and that's what this one did. The car had 180,000 miles on it, and so it didn't really owe me anything. The thing about it is, a belt tensioner should really be replaced when you replace your belt. That's the thing. Most people aren't going to do that. Belt tensioners wear, though, and they really need to be replaced because they can fail without warning like this one did. And if I'd have been on a long trip when this one failed, I'd have been in a mess. Well, you look at this, if you pay attention to these here, you got these different tensioners. That's the Gates, that's the Dayco, and that's the OEM. Look how the Gates and the OEM look so much alike. The Dayco's got their own design. You see that? I actually took them from 3 different angles and all that, so you could have a look at that. And the reason I'm going in on that was I went ahead and went to the parts store because it was a Saturday morning. The Ford place was closed. And this is a recent price list right here that I want to show you. $77.99 is what they get for it now. I paid $79 for it that morning, whenever, this would have been several years ago. And a few thousand miles later, the tensioner failed. And the way that some of those Dayco tensioners do, the pulley was out of line with the belt, and it started throwing the belt off. And so I got this $80 aftermarket tensioner and put it in the trash. And I went to the Ford place, and I paid $55 for an OEM replacement. The pricing experience that I saw here, now this right here, if you might notice, this price right here is what I found online yesterday. If you buy one from a Ford, parts online, I think I could probably beat this price over at the Ford dealer where I know the people. But that's what you would pay. You could theoretically get it for that. But the parts store is going to sell it for that price right there if you're just one of those walk-in-the-door customers. Anyway, you may have different... Well, the odd thing about parts like that is you can pay a whole bunch of different prices for parts. But the first time I ever discovered that the parts house could be more expensive than the dealer, which seems counterintuitive, was whenever I found out that an all-pressure sending unit for a Nissan pickup cost $8. I discovered that in 1983 at the dealer at a parts store, but at the dealer it was $2.48. Now I had to buy the $8 one because the dealer didn't have one, but I was really surprised at that. I couldn't imagine that until then. Since then, I've seen that in a lot of cases. I told the story one time about this clutch that we were putting in a Chevrolet that all the parts stores wanted $400 for. It was some kind of a Chevrolet car. I don't remember what it was, but it was the Sachs brand clutch, S-A-C-H, S-A-C-H-S. All the parts stores wanted about $400 for it. I went to the dealer and bought the same clutch, and as a matter of fact, from the dealer it was a Sachs brand, the same brand, and it was $150 from the GM dealer. That's not always the case. Sometimes you're going to pay more at the dealer, but you always need to check the price at the dealer just to see how it compares to what you're paying for it, paying at the parts house. You might be surprised sometimes. I know I have been a time or two. But anyway, so inferior parts, whenever you find some, are going to cost you in time. They're going to cost more in time than you save in money. And furthermore, you got to do the job more than once. Now, on more than a few occasions, when I've replaced a thermostat that was opening too cold, even when I was working at the dealership, and it didn't happen every time, but it happened a few times, the replacement part opened even colder than the original one. Now, on emission-friendly engines that we have today, 210 degrees is a good temperature, but 170 degrees is not. Not only does it perpetually cool, does running a perpetually cool engine prevent the emission system from doing its job, it promotes engine wear because water is created in the combustion chamber. Some of that vapor is going to go by the rings on a cooler running engine. It combines with the sulfur in the lube oil to form sulfuric acid and heavy sludge. Now that's going to vary depending on the oil you use, I understand that, but sludge is not good for anybody, and any engine oil can form sludge under the wrong conditions. Not good for the innards of the power plant. Sulfuric acid is a huge part of why the engine wears too. So that's why if you do more frequent oil changes, you have less engine wear. It's just the way that is. Well, in those cases where the first new thermostat didn't warm things up, I would finally get a good one after making them give me 3 or 4 more. Of course, you're having to do the job over and over again, and that's annoying, but your target is to get the engine temperature where it's supposed to be. And so this one here, the one that you see right over here, was one that was just stuck open. You know, and I held that so you could see the light through it and all that. But what you have here is, now you might notice that right in this area right here, you see that? All right, watch what happens whenever I change the slide. Wait a minute. Let me back up. There you go. See that? Watch it change. All right. See, there's where the water is stopped. The water stops right here until the thermostat opens, basically. You see, when the thermostat opens, then the water can go around it like that. But anyway, that's well, there's a wax element down in this area right here that expands and contracts. And of course, your electric thermostats have got wires going in with a heating element down here, so it can work like a regular thermostat, or the engine controller can open the thermostat if it wants to, which is pretty interesting. Some of your Toyotas and some other ones have that. Well, this one here was a Sebring convertible. It was a snazzy little ride. And it originally came to the school with as a matter of fact, if you start talking about this to people that work on cars, they'll bawl and squall about these, and they are really nasty to work on because of the fact that, particularly, unless it's got a 4-cylinder. You know, if it's a 4-cylinder, it's not so bad, but if it's got this 2.7 liter V6 in it, it's a booger bear, because it's crammed in there and it barely will fit. And all of these convertibles have got the 2.7 in them. All right. So it came with a P0125 code, and we replaced the thermostat to correct it. The thermostat on this one's kind of buried. It's not under the upper radiator hose neck where you'd expect it to be. It's basically in there behind the AC compressor. Now the bleeder is there, but the thermostat is on the forward bank of the engine, behind the alternator, and down there by the AC compressor. And it controls flow through the lower radiator hose, which is not a bad thing. Whenever you fill it up, you're a little less trouble having trapped air issues most of the time. If the thermostat is in the lower hose, it's a little easier to get the air out. Now this one here does have a bleeder. It's got that bleeder right there. And that bleeder is actually something that you're supposed to loosen that up and pour your coolant in until you see coolant appear there. You're not really supposed to open that with the engine running. You basically only open it whenever you're putting the coolant in there, and whenever all of the air has come out past that bleeder, you close it up. The problem with that is those bleeders have a tendency to hang up, and they have a tendency to freeze where you're trying to take them loose, and that housing plastic anyway. They sell this whole housing that comes with the coolant sensor most of the time at your parts store, that whole entire housing there, and that thing is going to wind up being about $50 or $60 last time I bought one. So despite the aggravating thermostat location, everything went smooth and by the numbers. We popped the thermostat in there, the code went away, the engine was warm again. What else would we ask for? A P0125 and a P0128 are very similar codes. They're basically talking about an engine that's running a little bit colder than it should. Or you fast forward 3,000 miles and a few months later, it comes back with the customer reporting cold engine symptoms again, and there's no MIL this time, no malfunction indicator light, but poor cabin heat. Now the temperature needle was near the center of the gauge. Prior learning pointed to the thermostat again, so I passed the ticket to Andrew and he went to work replacing it, which turned out to be an adventure this time. Now that block is aluminum, and those threads are 6mm 10 thread pitch, and the block is not very thick right there where that thermostat housing goes on there. That is a really dicey thing right there because that block is so thin in that spot. All right, so we took the thermostat just because I wanted to teach him something, so we removed the thermostat, put it with a torch, a thermometer, a can of water, and it started to open about 190 degrees. Well, there wasn't really much of a problem there because most of the time 194 is where they open. But a few weeks ago, we had tested a thermostat this way to verify the problem on an overheating vehicle, and it wasn't open even when the water was boiling, so we knew that one. Now this one didn't seem to be opening too soon, like I originally thought, because the 190 was about what I wanted, because that's the temperature where it begins to open, see, what's stamped on the thermostat. Because I'd seen so many replacement part failures, I had jumped to the conclusion the thermostat was letting the water flow too early. Now that was my error, at the student's expense. Now while he was reinstalling the thermostat housing, he was fingering the bolts into their holes, didn't like the way they felt going in, so he decided to chase the threads with a 6mm thread tap without removing the AC compressor, which was a bad idea. Choosing the proper tap from the Snap-on kit, though, he did do that. He chased the threads in one hole and managed to break the tap off in the second hole. That was a disaster. Well, what this is, imagine yourself looking, now this is an aluminum block. You couldn't just leave that bolt out of there. You can see that bolt where it goes right there. That's where it goes right there. And we had to helicoil it. But before we helicoil it, we had to get the broken tap off. So the tap's broke off and you're looking at a hole like that. We got the AC compressor off and out of the way. And so I took a drill bit that was just right. It seemed to me like it was 1/8 or something like that. And I drilled here, and here, and here, and here, just like you see right there. And once I did that, I was able to grab that broke off tap and turn it like a quarter of a turn and rattle it out of there. And then we managed to drill it out with a 1/4-inch bit and put this helicoil in there. And that took care of that issue that we had with that. And that was we dodged a bullet on that one, because that would have killed the car. So you mess this up where you can't put that thermostat housing back on, you got a car you can't drive, because there ain't no way you can keep that cooling in there. I mean, I guess you could probably, you know, do some kind of JB well junk or something like that, but that's always a dicey thing to do, especially when you're working on something that can burn the car up going down the road. Well, we put the replacement thermostat in there, we filled the cooling system, and that should have been the end of the job, but it wasn't. That's when we discovered what we should have checked before plowing into the thermostat replacement. With the Ease wireless vehicle interface, which I like to do that because you got a big screen over with yellow numbers on it, we connected to the Chrysler, and the engine coolant temperature was running bigger than life, right? It was warm again. The blower connector had suffered some heat damage due to oxidation and resistance, so we went ahead and took care of that while we was at it. That didn't have anything to do with the coolant problem, but at the same time, the gauge was lying to us. That gauge would consistently stay right there, and it never got over that. That looks perfectly okay, doesn't it? But with the vehicle interface hooked up to it, you know, which is basically a scan tool that's wireless and hooked to the computer over there, we were getting 240 and climbing, and there was no fan operation at all. Well, what was so interesting, the instrument temperature gauge gets its marching orders from the PCM by way of the body computer, and it remained near the halfway mark. Well, that was kind of silly. Now, I didn't want to tempt fate by letting the coolant get to a 260 just to see what the gauge would show. Excuse me, but this was peculiarity that fooled us into replacing the thermostat the second time. It would seem to me the gauge should have been more reliable than that. Well, I had seen a similar situation on a 95 New Yorker that I looked at in a convenience store parking lot with 3.5. In that particular one, the gauge never showed hot, but the engine was making air and percolating within a minute or two after you started it cold, and it seemed obvious to me that it was hotter than the comfortable temperature, and the owner claims to have fixed that one by putting a thermostat in it. And I didn't have time to look at it much that morning, but he said he put a thermostat in it and that took care of it, and that's fine. But sometimes you can, whenever one's making air, it seems to me like there's some kind of a head gasket issue or something like that going on. Here's the other thing though. Always try what's cheap and easy first. And the thermostat is the cheap and easy thing. So you pop a thermostat in it and you can see how easy that thermostat is to get to. It's right there on the top. And of course it's got a bleeder on it too, on that one. But perhaps the gauge error was due to a cool air bubble that was trapped at the sensor bulb. You know, you can't really tell because you can't see in there. Chrysler says if you experience cool heater hoses and an overheating engine with a full cooling system, the water pump is probably at fault, but the 2004 Sebring had a clean cooling system and less than 70,000 miles on it. So I sort of threw away the idea of a bad water pump, not to mention the fact that the water pump is driven by the timing chain and you practically have to pull the engine out of a car to put a water pump on it. That's not the cheap and easy thing. Ordinarily, I like to engage the air conditioning in a no fan situation to see if it forces fan operation, but we had drawn the refrigerant out of the AC to remove the compressor, so turning the AC on wouldn't engage the fan anyway. Thus, it wasn't an option unless we recharged the AC, and we were going to do that later. Now, the fan in this vehicle is driven by the PCM, which uses the ECT sensor to provide engine coolant temperature situation. Low fan is at 220. Then the way it comes on, low fan turns off at 208. High fan turns on at 230, and at 221 high fan goes off. So that's your fan steps right there. Well, the instrument cluster uses the same sensor to provide information to the gauge. See that? Now there's your coolant temperature gauge. Coolant temperature sensor goes through the PCM, through the body control module, on the PCI bus, into the instrument cluster. Look at all of those middlemen. You go from here to here to here, up there. That seems like a sort of a dicey way to handle that to me. I don't really like that. Now back in the day, they looked like this. You had a coolant temperature sensor that basically had, you know, this one here, this particular one I pulled was off of Ford, 74 ohms cold, 9.7 ohms hot. So if you shorted it to ground, that would go all the way to hot. So that one, there's no middleman there. See, what you see is what you get. It's either this, that screws into the ground, into the pipe threads, gives it to the ground, and then it goes up here, and you got a couple of coils in there, and basically whenever, you got voltage here, and so on and so forth, and a ground here. The more of a ground that there is coming through here, the more the gauge goes, toward the hot side. That was really simple and direct, and I always kind of liked that. Well, we flipped the cover off the underhood fuse box. Before I show you that, let me show you this crazy video right here. I thought you guys would enjoy this. I inserted this and I forgot that I put it in here. So, anyway, this was on a 2001 Pontiac Montana that we worked on. And look at that gauge. You keep watching that gauge, it does all kinds of crazy stuff. And it just goes down and up and around and about and all that. It's just the wackiest thing. And watch what it does in a minute. It'll go, she was noticing the gauge waggling around all over the place. And this thing just had a crazy engine coolant sensor. That's what it turned out to be. It was spurious and giving bad readings and all that. And the gauge was rapidly reflecting that. You can see it moving around. That is the actual time on that too. It's not, I didn't speed the film up or anything. All right, now what we did is flipped off the cover off. We got these fan relays here. Okay, so we got a radiator fan high relay there, that one here, and a low relay here, and then we got a 40 amp fuse right here that's supposed to feed them. We'll look at the schematic on that. All right, so here we've got, this was what our problem turned out. Now I've shown that picture before to illustrate this principle, but this is the actual car that came off of. There was no power here, there was no power there. See, you notice this is supposed to always be hot. Even with the key off, you should have power here and here on those common terminals. So that's the common terminal right there on both relays. And so that one and that one are fed by that bus inside that power distribution center. And the low fan relay control is here, high fan relay control is here, and there's your radiator fan with its 2 fan motors on it and all that kind of stuff. So what we had to do here was clean this terminal up really, really good, scratch it as good as we could, clean it as good as we could, replace that fuse, and then we wound up with fans, and we wound up with a cool running car. That was basically what we were after. Now, the temperature gun reading, though, on the upper hose, what happened there was the fan kicked on, all right? Let me go ahead and look at that slide right there. You're usually going to get 10, 15 amps a piece when running them fans. These were both pulling about that many amps. If they're running up around 25, 30 amps, that's just about too much. But the bleeder, it takes a 3/8 wrench. Odd that the bleeder on something like that would take a 3/8 wrench to open it. So anyway, but the fans kicked on after we replaced the fuse, but they kept on running and would not shut off. All right, now that's another problem, right? So basically, the temperature gun reading on the upper hose showed nearly 200 degrees. The lower hose with the thermostat in it was at a steady 83 to 85. And that little Chinese-made thermostat was sticking when it was fresh out of its little white box. So I told the parts counter man to bring me a thermostat that's not made in China, and he did. It looked and felt different. When I was trying to open the Chinese thermostat with my thumbs, I could actually feel it stick with my thumbs. The American-made unit had a more substantial spring and a better-looking wax pellet, and it felt better when I opened it, and it corrected the overheating problem. The fan cycled on and off normally, but I would never be happy with that temperature gauge if I was the owner, because you wouldn't trust it. There's a funny little thing here. This Explorer fuel gauge came in reading 3/4 of a tank. The vehicle had quit running, no fuel pressure, but I could hear the pump running. So I pulled the fuel pump relay, and using a meter, I actually measured how many amps the fuel pump was pulling and found only 1.5 amps. The Explorer was out of gas, because if it's pumping gas, it's going to pull 6 to 8 amps usually. It varies from vehicle to vehicle, but if you've got a pump that's only pulling 1 or 2 amps, it's going to be spinning dry. I added some gas, the amperage went up, the engine started, and we replaced the pump and sender and got her going again. All right, one more. This is vehicle number 3, the 97 Honda Civic, and it didn't have good AC performance. All right. Now we found a blend of R134A and R12 to start with. We hooked up our machine. That had to be pumped out and into the gray and yellow junk gas bottle, and we did that. Okay, so what we found out was, we refilled it with a good clean charge. The head pressure was shoving the high pressure switch open, causing the AC clutch to machine gun, because this one, like the Sebring, had melted that fuse that drove the fan. So we wound up having to clean those terminals as good as we could, make sure they fit tight, and push a new fuse down in there. I kind of like to sometimes put some dielectric grease, you know, that Motorcraft, what used to be WA10, but now it's caliper grease or whatever, and it's for electric stuff. I like to put that on those terminals so that they are prone not to oxidize as bad, because it, you know, it keeps oxygen away from them, but still lets the current flow. But this one had a heat damaged fuse situation too. Well, that's all, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's only like 23 minutes long, but I will see you guys next week.